On the 23rd of March, 2013, history was quietly made within the august halls of the High Court of Justice in London. Lord Justice Peregrine Simon delivered a landmark judgment in a civil libel case, yet its implications were profoundly criminal. He officially named David Charles Hunt, a wealthy property developer from Hertfordshire, as the undisputed head of an organised crime network, unequivocally implicating him in extreme violence, systemic intimidation, and widespread fraud. Crucially, this was not a criminal trial. Hunt had never been convicted of anything remotely serious. In fact, his sole criminal conviction dated back to 1987, a relatively minor charge of handling stolen goods, resulting only in a 9-month suspended sentence. The central question emerged: how could a man with one minor conviction in the 1980s find himself officially labelled a major crime boss by Britain's highest legal system? The answer lay 3 decades earlier, in a very different pocket of East London. Before the trappings of wealth, the 7-bedroom mansion, the private swimming pool, the golf club membership, the fine restaurants, the labyrinthine offshore companies, and the sprawling property empire, there was Canning Town. This was a tough, working-class area where reputation was the only currency that mattered. And it was here that David Hunt began his apprenticeship in exactly how to build and enforce that reputation. What makes this story truly remarkable, however, is not merely the narrative of one man's violent and intimidating ascent. It is the story of the system itself, the mechanisms of justice that observed his activities unfold over decades and, seemingly, either could not or would not intervene to stop them. Over the course of 3 decades, Hunt would successfully derail more than 30 separate police investigations. The pattern was devastatingly effective: witnesses would abruptly withdraw their statements, crucial cases would mysteriously collapse, detectives would receive explicit death threats, and then, shockingly, those same officers would face internal criminal investigation themselves merely for reporting those threats. When the definitive truth finally emerged, it was not within the confines of a criminal court seeking justice for specific crimes. Welcome to UK True Crime Files. If careful, UK-focused crime reporting matters to you, a quick subscription helps us cover complex cases like this one with the necessary detail and the respect they deserve. So, let us begin at the beginning. Canning Town, 1961. David Charles Hunt was born in this corner of East London, the youngest of 13 children in a large family. His parents, he would later claim, were devout Christians who instilled in him a powerful work ethic. The location itself speaks volumes. Canning Town in the 1960s and 70s was far removed from leafy suburbia. It was defined by the docks, the factories, and tight-knit communities where anonymity was impossible. Reputations here were not freely given, they had to be violently earned. Hunt left school at 16 and quickly established himself as an amateur boxer, by all accounts, a ferocious and formidable opponent. Standing 6 feet 5 inches with a powerful build, he was quick with his fists and earned considerable respect in the ring. Outside the ropes, he worked securing pubs and clubs across East London. Officially, on paper, he was also listed as a part-time scaffolder and scrap metal dealer. But according to the investigative journalist Michael Gillard, who spent years tracking Hunt, he had already become a successful, albeit uncharged, criminal figure by the late 1970s. His brothers were involved too. Both Colin and Raymond Hunt carried criminal convictions. The Hunt name was quickly becoming a designation of power within certain underworld circles. In April 1986, David Hunt was finally arrested for conspiracy to handle stolen goods and possession of a weapon found at his brother Colin's business address. This resulted in that 9-month suspended sentence, his first, and, remarkably, his only serious conviction for decades. 2 years later, in 1988, Hunt moved upmarket, leaving Canning Town behind. He purchased a property at 20 Round Road, Epping, straddling the Essex-Hertfordshire border, a definite step toward respectability. Around the same time, the Metropolitan Police launched Operation Tiger, specifically targeting leading criminals operating in the Plaistow area. The operation produced an intelligence tool they called the Spider Diagram. This diagram mapped known criminals, their associates, their activities, and the complex connections between them. At the very center of that menacing web was David Hunt. The diagram linked him directly to protection rackets, the control of pubs and clubs, an active involvement in prostitution rings in Soho. Crucially, this was 1988, and Hunt was only 27 years old. Operation Tiger led to several arrests, but David Hunt himself remained untouchable. His brother, Raymond, was convicted for handling stolen checks following a separate intelligence operation called Haddock. Yet, David, once again, walked away clear. Remember the dichotomy. On paper, in 1988, Hunt was merely a scaffolder and a pub security guard. Yet police intelligence painted him as the linchpin of organised crime in East London. The pattern of invulnerability was now set. Most career criminals, if meticulous, might avoid prosecution once, perhaps twice if they were extremely lucky and well connected. David Hunt would manage to avoid it more than 30 times. Let us walk through some key examples of this pattern. In 1989, two bodies, Maxine Arnold and Terry Goodam, were discovered in Epping Forest. Both murders remain officially unsolved, yet Hunt's name surfaced repeatedly in the investigation and he was formally linked to the case. Despite the gravity, nothing ever proceeded. That same year, Peter Wilson, a journalist working for the Sunday Mirror travelled to Hunt's house seeking answers about those Epping Forest killings. Hunt's response was immediate and savage. He headbutted Wilson and repeatedly punched him in the ribs. Wilson later recounted the terrifying experience in court. The speed and aggression was bewildering. He grabbed me by the lapels, whacked me with his head straight into my eye socket, shook me around like a rag doll. Hunt was duly arrested for assault. Yet, in the now familiar refrain, Wilson swiftly withdrew his complaint. In 1994, during a racing pigeon event, an unlikely setting, given Hunt was a keen enthusiast, he caused grievous bodily harm to a man named Stuart Everett. Everett required serious medical treatment. Hunt was charged, and the case went to trial in November 1995. He was, inevitably, acquitted. Then came 1997, a case that should have been undeniable, because the police had it on tape. Operation Blackjack involved the Metropolitan Police installing covert listening devices inside an East London car showroom to monitor criminal activity. The recording captured David Hunt slashing a man's face, Paul Kavanagh, resulting in a 15-centimetre laceration, running from ear to chin, requiring immediate, life-saving medical treatment. Kavanagh had reportedly upset one of Hunt's associates. Hunt personally delivered the brutal punishment. The police possessed the recording of the attack, coupled with irrefutable medical evidence, and a clear victim. Hunt was arrested and charged. And then, Paul Kavanagh withdrew his statement. The Crown Prosecution Service promptly dropped the case. According to evidence that would later surface in the High Court, Kavanagh had been subjected to severe intimidation and threats, making him understand that giving evidence against David Hunt would result in dire, perhaps fatal, consequences. By the late 1990s, a definitive picture was forming, not only within confidential criminal intelligence files but crucially in the minds of the frustrated detectives working these cases. Hunt was not avoiding prosecution through clever legal maneuvering or slipping through minor procedural gaps. He was actively making witnesses too terrified to testify. Operation Tiberius, launched in 2002, addressed this failure bluntly in its intelligence report. The report stated, quote, "The Hunt Syndicate has achieved invulnerability through a mixture of utilizing corrupt police contacts and the intimidation of witnesses." That word again, *invulnerability*. But intimidation only functions successfully if people are acutely aware of what you are capable of. Hunt made absolutely certain that they were. Let us now examine precisely how he established this fear and why even law enforcement officers were not immune from the danger he posed. The Sunday Mirror incident in 1989 was relatively contained, a journalist on Hunt's doorstep, a quick, violent lesson delivered. But by the 2000s, Hunt's violence had become far more brazen, executed in increasingly public arenas. Case in point, 2006, the Royal Courts of Justice in central London. A property developer named Billy Allen was entangled in a legal dispute. He and another man, Charles Matthews, both claimed ownership of the same valuable plot of land near the Olympic Development Zone. Matthews was a convicted robber-turned-drug trafficker, and he was also connected to David Hunt. Matthews began spreading the damaging suggestion that Billy Allen was a police informant, or a grass in the criminal underworld, a virtual death sentence without the physical act itself, granting unofficial permission for anyone to act against him. Matthews also directly enlisted Hunt's assistance. According to underworld sources later cited in the Sunday Times, Hunt stood to financially benefit immensely from the sale of that land. He intended to acquire it, then flip it to the notorious Adams family, another powerful North London crime syndicate also actively buying up property in the area. Billy Allen knew Hunt's reputation and was worried, with substantial good reason. During a court hearing, inside the courthouse itself, Hunt arrived with a group of enforcers. They proceeded to attack Billy Allen right there in the court lobby. When police arrived, the walls and floor were slicked with blood. Consider that setting for a moment, not a hidden alleyway, not a derelict warehouse, but a courthouse in central London, in broad daylight. And yet, David Hunt faced absolutely no criminal proceedings for this outrage. The message was perfectly unmistakable: Hunt could deploy violent enforcers anywhere, even within a building secured by lawyers, professional security, and police officers. If you were not safe in the High Court, you were not safe anywhere. But violence was not Hunt's only effective tool. He possessed something equally valuable: money, and copious amounts of it. By the mid-1990s, Hunt had constructed what appeared, on the surface, to be a sophisticated, legitimate business empire: scrap metal yards, extensive property holdings, a golf club in Essex, the Epping Forest Country Club, numerous restaurants, and a network of offshore companies. In 1994, he purchased O'Malley's, that 7-bedroom mansion in Hertfordshire, complete with a swimming pool, tennis courts, and 20 acres of private land, the very property mentioned at the start of this story. He later bought commercial premises in Soho, acquiring extremely valuable real estate. On paper, David Hunt was the quintessential successful property developer, a self-made businessman who had risen from humble, working-class beginnings. There was just one fundamental problem: he failed to pay tax. From 1982 to 1996, a staggering period of 14 years, Hunt filed no tax returns whatsoever. When the Inland Revenue finally tracked him down, Hunt feigned modesty, claiming he had primarily worked as a scaffolder and that his income was highly modest. He was later forced to admit that the loan applications for his vast properties contained fraudulent information regarding his employment history. This was his answer years later during the libel trial when he was asked directly, "How do you afford a mansion like Molly's after just 5 years of scaffolding work?" "I can't recall how I did it, but it wasn't through proceeds of crime." According to the eventual trial judge, Hunt's company, GRL, was nothing more than a front, a vehicle specifically designed for laundering ill-gotten gains. GRL also owned a property in Soho. On the surface, it purported to be offices or maybe retail space. In reality, it operated as a clip joint, the brothel. From 1995 until 2001, the property was actively used for prostitution. Hunt maintained that he had no idea what was happening inside the building. He owned it, he received the rent, but claimed total ignorance of its purpose. The judge, unsurprisingly, did not believe him. To recap, we have multiple, brutal violent assaults, dozens of collapsed prosecutions, zero tax payment spanning 14 years, and a huge property empire with no visible legal income source. The Metropolitan Police were fully aware of every detail. So why exactly couldn't they act? Because by 2002, when Operation Tiberius began its dedicated examination of North and East London crime groups, they uncovered something significantly worse than Hunt's criminal activities. They discovered precisely who was protecting him. As 2012 rapidly approached, London was preparing for the Olympic Games. The East End, Stratford, Hackney Wick, areas adjacent to Canning Town, were undergoing radical transformation, compulsory purchase orders, land regeneration schemes, and massive government investment. And wherever government money flows, significant opportunities for criminality follow. Michael Gillard, an investigative journalist who had been following organised crime in East London since the late 1990s, noticed a disturbing trend as the Olympics neared. Criminal families, syndicates with long histories of violence, drug trafficking, and fraud were suddenly appearing as legitimate landowners. They were receiving huge compensation payments from a £20 million government fund earmarked for land acquisition and regeneration. One of those families was directly connected to David Hunt. Gillard had spent years tracking Hunt, observing the recurring pattern, collapsed cases, intimidated witnesses, and unexplained, rapid wealth. Now, Hunt was involved in taxpayer-funded land deals worth millions. Gillard decided it was finally time to publish the truth. On the 23rd of May, 2010, the Sunday Times ran a comprehensive, detailed investigation. The headline was stark: Underworld Kings Cash In on Taxpayer Land Fund. The article named several criminal syndicates benefiting from Olympic-related land sales, featuring Terry Adams, head of the notorious Adams family, prominently. And right there in the same article was David Hunt. The piece unequivocally described Hunt as a crime lord. It meticulously detailed allegations of violence, intimidation, and land fraud, connecting him to a brewing turf war over the Olympic development land. Crucially, it referenced Operation Tiberius, the police corruption inquiry that had found Hunt maintained contacts inside the Metropolitan Police. For Hunt, this was fundamentally different from mere bad press. Police investigations operate behind sealed doors, evidence is confidential, witnesses can be privately intimidated before any trial date. But this was public, published in one of Britain's most respected newspapers, linking him explicitly to organised crime, especially in the sensitive context of the Olympics. Hunt immediately sued the Sunday Times for libel. Here is why this lawsuit truly mattered. In a libel case, the burden of proof is radically different from a criminal trial. The newspaper did not have to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They only needed to demonstrate, on the balance of probabilities, that what they published was substantially true. Furthermore, in a libel trial, Hunt would be compelled to testify. He would have to answer questions, under oath, in open court about his true wealth, his complex businesses, his associations, and his violent past. For 30 years, Hunt had successfully evaded precisely this scenario. Witnesses withdrew, cases collapsed, and he never had to take the stand. But if he wished to clear his name and prove that the Sunday Times had defamed him, he would have to sit in that witness box and finally explain himself. The Sunday Times legal team began preparing its counterattack, instructed to prove every single claim. Find the witnesses, secure the police reports, and build the definitive case that Hunt had successfully evaded for 3 decades. Michael Gillard became the lead investigative witness. Hunt, refusing to back down, made a decision that would define his legacy. He proceeded with the libel action. The trial was set for 2013, a 5-week hearing in the High Court of Justice. It was destined to expose far more than just Hunt's activities. It would ultimately reveal the institutional corruption that had allowed him to flourish. The 2013 libel trial lasted 5 tumultuous weeks and exposed not only the details of Hunt's criminal network but also the Metropolitan Police officers who had actively protected it. In March 2013, David Hunt took the witness stand. Tall, standing 6 feet 5 inches, and immaculately dressed, he presented himself as a rough diamond businessman, self-made and heartbroken by the reckless allegations against him. His barrister painted a sympathetic portrait, a man from a tough background who had worked hard, built a legitimate empire, only to have his reputation destroyed by irresponsible journalism. But the Sunday Times had spent 3 years preparing its counterattack. Michael Gillard had compiled an overwhelming dossier of evidence, police reports, raw intelligence assessments, witness testimony, financial records, and crucially, the classified Operation Tiberius report. Tiberius, the 2002 Met Police Intelligence Project, was designed to examine North and East London organised crime groups, assessing their methods and vulnerabilities. Portions of the full report were read aloud in court, proving damning. The Tiberius assessment confirmed, quote, "The Hunt Syndicate has developed an extensive criminal empire that has hitherto evaded significant penetration from law enforcement." The report continued, quote, "The syndicate has achieved this invulnerability through a mixture of utilizing corrupt police contacts and the intimidation of witnesses brave enough to give evidence against them." Corrupt police contacts. The report specifically named for serving Metropolitan Police detectives who were providing information to the Hunt Syndicate, leaking details of ongoing investigations, running sensitive database checks, and even revealing the exact locations of tracking devices placed on Hunt's vehicles. One of those officers was described as being high-profile and later testified to Parliament about police corruption. But the institutional betrayal became even worse. Detective Chief Inspector David McKelvey took the stand, a former officer who had worked organised crime cases in East London. In January 2008, McKelvey submitted a chilling report to his borough commander. David Hunt, he stated, had taken out a contract, not on a rival, nor a witness, but on the very detectives investigating him. McKelvey wrote that he had, quote, "No doubt that David Hunt has the motive, means, and capability of funding this contract to kill." He continued, stating Hunt, quote, "runs his criminal network by use of extreme violence. Murder is second nature to him. He is believed to have been personally involved in several contract killings." McKelvey warned his superiors and reported the threat, following every protocol. And what happened next? The Metropolitan Police opened a criminal investigation, not into Hunt, but into McKelvey. McKelvey and two other detectives, including Detective Sergeant Darren Grip, were subjected to a 2-year investigation by the Met's Professional Standards Unit, the so-called Ghost Squad usually reserved for corrupt officers. McKelvey later testified that the investigation was based on flawed evidence, discredited intelligence, and information the Met knew to be demonstrably false. McKelvey's career was destroyed, he suffered a nervous breakdown. He and Grip eventually sued the Met. In 2016, the Metropolitan Police were forced to issue an official apology for subjecting them to criminal investigation after they had simply reported death threats. Think about the implications of that action. You are a detective investigating a powerful criminal. That criminal places a contract on your life. You report this critical threat to your bosses, and they launch an investigation into *U*. If you are from East London or remember the press coverage when this story broke, please share your thoughts respectfully and factually below. We are keen to hear your perspective. We have progressed from Olympic land deals to court testimony detailing contract killings, corrupt officers, and profound institutional betrayal. The ultimate question the judge had to answer, as this was a civil trial, there was no jury, was simple: was any of it true? Hunt's defense team fought fiercely, portraying their client as a victim of long-standing police prejudice, a man whose reputation had been maliciously linked to crimes committed by others who simply used his name for protection. Hunt himself testified that he was shocked when he saw the article, claiming it had crucified him. He compared the damage to losing his parents young, arguing he could not be held responsible for a reputation that had unfairly dogged him since he grew up in a tough area. But the Sunday Times presented the cold, hard evidence, the slashing of Paul Kavanagh, recorded covertly during Operation Blackjack, the brazen Billy Allen courthouse attack, supported by witness statements, medical records, and police attendance logs, the overwhelming financial irregularities, 14 years without tax returns, false information on mortgage applications, and offshore companies with no plausible legitimate purpose. The Soho properties owned by his company GRL, confirmed as being used for prostitution from 1995 to 2001. Witness after witness testified. Peter Wilson, the journalist headbutted in 1989, described the attack in visceral detail, the speed, the aggression, being shaken like a rag doll. Former police officers detailed the intelligence assessments and the spider diagrams, placing Hunt squarely at the center of criminal networks. Financial analysts confirmed the mathematical impossibility of Hunt's declared income supporting his actual assets. The trial concluded after 5 weeks. Lord Justice Peregrine Simon then delivered his momentous judgment. He found, on the balance of probabilities, that David Hunt was indeed the head of an organised crime network. He found that Hunt had engaged in extreme violence and pervasive intimidation, using that violence specifically to scare witnesses and ensure he avoided criminal prosecution. He concluded that GRL was a front for money laundering and found that Hunt had received proceeds directly derived from prostitution. He did not, however, find sufficient evidence for the more serious allegations of murder or large-scale drug trafficking. The newspaper had not met the required standard for those specific claims. But on the core allegation that Hunt was a crime boss who evaded justice through systemic violence and corruption, the judge ruled firmly in favor of the Sunday Times star. David Hunt had lost. With that loss, the first official, public ruling on his criminal activities was entered into the public record. But would the judgment actually stick? Lord Justice Simon's ruling was unequivocal. Hunt was, quote, the head of an organised crime network implicated in extreme violence and fraud. This was not a police intelligence report locked away in a filing cabinet. This was not a collapsed prosecution that never made it to court. This was a High Court judgment, a public record containing legally binding findings of fact. For the first time in Hunt's entire criminal career, his activities had been officially documented by Britain's legal system. The Sunday Times had won, Michael Gillard had been vindicated, the journalism was deemed substantially true. Hunt owed the newspaper £85,000 in legal costs. He paid £55,000 the very next day. The remaining £30,000 arrived 10 days later. For a man who had claimed he couldn't recall how he'd afforded a 7-bedroom mansion on a scaffolder's wages, suddenly locating £85,000 in a fortnight did not appear to present the slightest problem. Now, here is where the story pivots. Hunt had the automatic right to appeal. The judgment was reputationally devastating. Logically, one would expect him to fight it tooth and nail, to challenge the findings, to try and overturn the ruling. He did not. He accepted the judgment entirely. No appeal, no further legal action. By choosing not to appeal, Hunt allowed the first and only official ruling on his criminal activities to stand permanently. This was a monumental strategic miscalculation because now, his status was not merely alleged, rumored, or confined to police intelligence that might never see the light of day. It was established fact in law, forever. Any future journalist writing about David Hunt can cite Lord Justice Simon's judgment. They can state, as a matter of legal record, that he was found to be a crime boss. The libel trial had accomplished what 3 decades of criminal investigations could not. It had created an official, public, and unchallengeable account of David Hunt's true activities. But the essential question continued to haunt detectives, prosecutors, and journalists alike: if a High Court judge can declare someone the head of an organised crime network, and if the evidence is robust enough to triumph in a civil trial, why was there still no criminal prosecution? The answer is complex. Civil trials demand a lower burden of proof, balance of probabilities, not a beyond reasonable doubt. The very evidence that secured the libel victory might not satisfy the higher criminal standard. Furthermore, witnesses willing to testify in a civil trial might understandably be unwilling to face Hunt in a criminal court, where a conviction means a prison sentence and the stakes for retaliation are infinitely higher. And finally, there was the corruption issue. If serving police officers were proven to be feeding information to Hunt, how could the Met effectively build a criminal case without it being fatally compromised? Operation Tiberius had identified the cancer, but identifying corrupt officers and prosecuting them were two distinct and immensely difficult tasks. So David Hunt walked away from the High Court in 2013 with a damning legal judgment against him, but with no change to his criminal record beyond that minor 1987 conviction. One would naturally assume that losing in court and being publicly named as a crime lord would signify the end of the story. Yet, for David Hunt, it was barely an inconvenience. For David Hunt, the devastating libel loss was barely an inconvenience. But for others, the consequences were severe. Michael Gillard, the tenacious journalist who had broken the story, secured his victory in court and was rightly named Journalist of the Year. Yet, the price of that truth was immediate and isolating. He could not attend the ceremony in person. For his safety, Gillard ceased attending public events in London and maintained a profoundly low profile. The man who had spent years exposing the inner workings of organised crime was now forced to live with the chilling reality that those very criminals knew his identity and whereabouts. The consequences were no less severe for the officers involved. Detective David McKelvey, who had bravely reported death threats only to find himself under investigation for doing so, never recovered professionally. The 2-year criminal investigation, despite concluding with no findings against him, effectively destroyed his reputation within the Metropolitan Police, the Met. He suffered a nervous breakdown. In 2016, 3 years after the landmark libel trial, McKelvey and Detective Sergeant Darren Grip sued the Met. The force issued an apology, acknowledging they had been wrong to investigate the officers. However, an apology cannot restore a career or undo profound professional damage. McKelvey had simply done his duty, followed protocol, only to watch the system turn against him. Thus, the final score, a devastating court loss for Hunt, corrupt police exposed, a journalist forced into hiding, and a detective's career irrevocably destroyed. And then, there was Hunt himself. Just 3 months after losing the libel trial, and 3 months after being publicly identified as a major crime boss, David Hunt received a £1 million loan from David Sullivan. Sullivan, a wealthy businessman, a former pornographer turned property magnate, was at the time the co-owner of West Ham United Football Club. The transaction was executed via Sullivan's finance firm, GCN 102 Limited, and paid directly to Hunt UK Properties, a company directed by Hunt. The loan was agreed on the 3rd of October, 2013. The timing was noteworthy. The Sunday Times was owed £85,000 in costs. £55,000 was paid the very next day, with another £300,000 released 10 days later. The loan was secured against multiple Hunt properties, including the Epping Forest Country Club, a site once owned by actor Sean Connery and the late West Ham captain, Bobby Moore. Sullivan was not the only source of finance willing to overlook the court findings. Lloyds Bank, which at the time was partly owned by the UK taxpayer following the 2008 financial crisis, agreed to lend Hunt up to £4 million. This willingness to lend was apparent even around the time Hunt was fighting the libel battle. Lloyds would have necessarily conducted due diligence and vetted Hunt as a customer, yet they proceeded regardless. Barclays, however, reacted differently. When a manager read reports of the libel case, Barclays immediately called in a £4.2 million loan, forcing Hunt to refinance. That necessity is where the substantial Lloyds loan found its place. To be absolutely clear, a man who had just been formally ruled in open court to be the head of a sophisticated criminal network was simultaneously receiving millions in loans from both a Premier League football club owner and a taxpayer-backed high street bank. Liabilities declared by Sullivan's companies a few months later suggest Hunt's loan was repaid swiftly. Where that money came from remains opaque, as Hunt's financial affairs post-trial are notoriously difficult to track. Yet, these loans raise serious questions. Why would Sullivan lend £1 million to someone so publicly branded a crime boss? What, precisely, was the nature of their relationship? Neither Sullivan nor Hunt has ever offered a public explanation for this transaction. While legal, a private deal between two businessmen, it powerfully underscores Hunt's continued access to wealth and influence, even immediately following the most damaging public ruling of his life. Meanwhile, the wider institutional implications of the trial continued to unfold. The Metropolitan Police faced a critical crisis of confidence. The explosive findings of Operation Tiberius concerning corrupt officers could not be simply ignored. Yet, prosecuting corrupt police officers is notoriously complex. The standards of evidence are exceptionally high, and the blue wall of silence is a very real impediment. To this day, it remains unclear how many of the officers named in Operation Tiberius faced disciplinary action, let alone criminal charges. The broader scandal surrounding Met corruption in the 2000s, encompassing the Stephen Lawrence inquiry cover-up, the Daniel Morgan murder case, and allegations of collusion with organised crime, painted a picture of an institution in profound distress. And at the centre of one of those key scandals sat David Hunt. As of 2026, Hunt still resides in his Hertfordshire mansion, Molly's, the property he purchased back in 1994. He lives there with his wife, Tina, and their adult children. He maintains a hobby of racing pigeons, prized birds. In 2020, his son even pinned a handwritten note to a village notice board asking neighbours not to shoot the pigeons with their rifles, as some had been killed. The note was polite and respectful, describing the birds simply as pets. It is a strange, jarring image, a man ruled by a high court judge to be a violent crime boss, whose son writes polite public appeals about injured pigeons. Hunt himself has never been charged with a serious criminal offence since the libel trial. The 2013 judgment remains the only official finding against him. He denies all allegations of ongoing criminal activity. And so, the lingering question returns: if a High Court judge can name you as a crime boss in 2013, why are you still living freely in your mansion in 2026? This brings us back to the question that began this inquiry: if a judge can officially name someone as the head of an organized crime network, why is there no subsequent criminal prosecution? The answer exposes uncomfortable, systemic truths about the British justice system. First, the evidence threshold. In the civil libel trial, the Sunday Times merely needed to prove their claims on the balance of probabilities, a certainty of just 51% or more likely than not. In a criminal trial, the standard is far higher, beyond reasonable doubt. The Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, requires evidence so strong that a jury is left with no reasonable uncertainty. The same body of evidence can satisfy one standard but utterly fail to meet the other. Herein lay the problem. Many of Hunt's alleged crimes relied heavily on witness testimony. These were witnesses who had already experienced intimidation, who had withdrawn statements, and who knew what typically happened to those who dared to testify against Hunt. Asking them to testify in a criminal trial, where Hunt's freedom was at stake and the consequences were prison, represented a proposition of far greater scrutiny and danger. The CPS would have required fully cooperative witnesses and untainted evidence, a case that could not be derailed by a single compromised officer or a single withdrawn statement. And according to Operation Tiberius, the Hunt network had corrupt officers feeding them information. How does the state successfully build a robust criminal case when the very organization responsible for constructing it, the police, has been infiltrated? Second question: what became of those corrupt officers? Operation Tiberius identified them back in 2002. The libel trial exposed their existence to the world in 2013. Yet, public records show no mass prosecutions of Metropolitan Police officers for colluding with the Hunt syndicate. Were they quietly disciplined, moved to different roles, or allowed to resign? Are some still serving? We simply do not know. The Met has never been transparent about the outcomes of those corruption investigations. That pervasive uncertainty is corrosive. It profoundly undermines public trust. If officers can feed crucial intelligence to organized criminals and face no visible consequences, what message does that send to the public and to other potential whistleblowers? Third question: the money. David Sullivan's £1 million loan and Lloyds Bank's £4 million facility were both legal and private business transactions. But they occurred after the libel ruling, after Hunt was publicly named. Why? What connecting factor existed between Sullivan and Hunt? Was it purely commercial, or was there a deeper relationship? Sullivan has never publicly explained the loan, neither has Hunt. Without transparency, the public is left to draw its own potentially damaging conclusions. It is crucial to state clearly: David Hunt denies all allegations of ongoing criminal activity. He has not been charged with any serious criminal offense since 1987. The 2013 libel judgment is a civil ruling, not a criminal conviction. In the cold light of the law, Hunt is not a convicted criminal. He is merely a businessman with one minor historical conviction and a lost civil case. But in the considered opinion of a High Court judge who heard 5 weeks of evidence detailing violence, extortion, and systemic corruption, he is the head of an organized crime network. Both things are, legally, true. That uncomfortable reality compels us to ask, what does justice truly mean in modern Britain? Is it solely defined by securing a criminal conviction, or is it achieved when the truth enters the public record, even if no one is sent to prison? Michael Gillard achieved something momentous. He exposed Hunt's activities, won the libel case, and ensured the truth was officially documented. Yet, Gillard is living in fear. McKelvey's career was destroyed. Witnesses live in perpetual anxiety. And Hunt still resides comfortably in his mansion. So, who truly won? The British justice system operates on 2 distinct tracks, criminal and civil. Sometimes, the civil track delivers accountability when the criminal track is simply unable to proceed. The libel trial performed this function. It created a permanent, official record of Hunt's nefarious activities. But it failed to put him in prison. It failed to seize his assets. And crucially, it failed to dismantle his network. And that raises a final, inescapable question: if the system cannot prosecute someone, even after a high court judge rules they are a crime boss, is the system fundamentally working? Or has this individual simply become too large, too connected, and too insulated for traditional justice mechanisms to reach them? There is no easy answer. But the question itself remains profoundly important. If those questions matter to you, if you believe in investigative journalism that follows the evidence, even when it leads to uncomfortable, complex places, consider subscribing. We will continue to cover cases like this, the ones that defy easy headlines, the ones that demand patience, care, and a willingness to sit with the inherent complexity. Because the truth, as they often say, is stranger than fiction. Thank you for watching.